Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. The Crisis in Our Party, published May 1904. Paragraph 1 of the Rules. We have already cited the different formulations around which an interesting debate flared up at the Congress. This debate took up nearly 2 sittings and ended with 2 roll call votes. During the entire Congress there were, if I am not mistaken, only 8 roll call votes, which were resorted to only in very important cases because of the great loss of time they involved. The question at issue was undoubtedly one of principle. The interest of the Congress in the debate was tremendous. All the delegates voted, a rare occurrence at our Congress, as at any big Congress, and one that likewise testifies to the interest displayed by the disputants. What, then, was the substance of the matter in dispute? I already said at the Congress, and have since repeated it time and again, that I by no means consider our difference, over paragraph 1, so vital as to be a matter of life or death to the party. We shall certainly not perish because of an unfortunate clause in the rules. p. 250. 1. Taken by itself, this difference, although it did reveal shades of principle, could never have called forth that divergence. Actually, to speak unreservedly, that split, which took place after the Congress. But every little difference may become a big one if it is insisted on, if it is put into the foreground, if people set about searching for all the roots and branches of the difference. Every little difference may assume tremendous importance if it serves as the starting point for a swing towards definite mistaken views, and if these mistaken views are combined, by virtue of new and additional divergences, with anarchistic actions which bring the party to the point of a split. And that is just what happened in the present case. The comparatively slight difference over paragraph 1 has now acquired tremendous importance, because it was this that started the swing towards the opportunist profundities and anarchistic phrase-mongering of the minority, especially at the League Congress, and subsequently in the columns of the new Iskra as well. It was this that marked the beginning of the coalition of the Iskra-ist minority with the anti-Iskraists and the Marsh, which assumed final and definite shape by the time of the elections, and without understanding which it is impossible to understand the major and fundamental divergence over the composition of the central bodies. The slight mistake of Martov and Axelrod over paragraph 1 was a slight crack in our pot, as I put it at the League Congress. The pot could be bound tight with a hard knot, and not a hangman's knot, as it was misunderstood by Martov, who during the League Congress was in a state bordering on hysteria, or all efforts could be directed towards widening the crack and breaking the pot in two. And that is what happened, thanks to the boycott and similar anarchistic moves of the zealous Martovites. The difference over paragraph 1 played no small part in the elections to the central bodies, and Martov's defeat in the elections led him into a struggle over principles with the use of grossly mechanical and even brawling methods, such as his speeches at the Congress of the League of Russian Revolutionary Social Democracy Abroad. Now, after all these happenings, the question of paragraph 1 has thus assumed tremendous importance, and we must clearly realize both the character of the Congress groupings in the voting on this paragraph and, far more important still, the real nature of those shades of opinion which revealed or began to reveal themselves over paragraph 1. Now, after the events with which the reader is familiar, the question stands as follows: did Martov's formulation, which was supported by Axelrod, reflect his, or their, instability, vacillation, and political vagueness, as I expressed it at the Party Congress, p. 333, his, or their, deviation towards Juricism and anarchism, as Plekhanov suggested at the League Congress, League Minutes, p. 102 and elsewhere? Or did my formulation, which was supported by Plekhanov, reflect a wrong, bureaucratic, formalistic, jack-in-office, unsocial democratic conception of centralism, opportunism and anarchism, or bureaucracy and formalism? That is the way the question stands now, when the little difference has become a big one. And when discussing the pros and cons of my formulation on their merits, we must bear in mind just this presentation of the question, which has been forced upon us all by the events, or, I would say if it did not sound too pompous, has been evolved by history. Let us begin the examination of these pros and cons with an analysis of the Congress debate. The first speech, that of Comrade Egorov, is interesting only for the fact that his attitude, non-liquor, it is not yet clear to me, I do not yet know where the truth lies, was very characteristic of the attitude of many delegates, who found it difficult to grasp the rights and wrongs of this really new and fairly complex and detailed question. The next speech, that of Comrade Axelrod, at once made the issue one of principle. This was the first speech Comrade Axelrod made at the Congress on questions of principle, one might even say the first speech he made at all, and it can scarcely be claimed that his debut with the celebrated professor was particularly fortunate. I think, Comrade Axelrod said, that we must draw a distinction between the concepts party and organization. These two concepts are being confused here. And the confusion is dangerous. That was the first argument against my formulation. Examine it more closely. When I say that the party should be the sum, and not the mere arithmetical sum, but a complex, of organizations, the word organization is commonly employed in two senses, a broad and a narrow one. In the narrow sense it signifies an individual nucleus of a collective of people with at least a minimum degree of coherent form. In the broad sense it signifies the sum of such nuclei united into a whole. For example, the Navy, the Army, or the state is at one and the same time a sum of organizations, in the narrow sense of the word, and a variety of social organization, in the broad sense of the word. The Department of Education is an organization, in the broad sense of the word, and consists of a number of organizations, in the narrow sense of the word. Similarly, the party is an organization, should be an organization, in the broad sense of the word. At the same time, the party should consist of a whole number of diversified organizations, in the narrow sense of the word. Therefore, when he spoke of drawing a distinction between the concepts party and organization, Comrade Axelrod, firstly, did not take account of the difference between the broad and the narrow sense of the word organization, and, secondly, did not observe that he was himself confusing organized and unorganized elements. Lenin, does that mean that I confuse the concepts party and organization? Of course not. I thereby express clearly and precisely my wish, my demand, that the party, as the vanguard of the class, should be as organized as possible, that the party should admit to its ranks only such elements as allow of at least a minimum of organization. My opponent, on the contrary, lumps together in the party organized and unorganized elements, those who lend themselves to direction and those who do not, the advanced and the incorrigibly backward, for the corrigibly backward can join an organization. This confusion is indeed dangerous. Comrade Axelrod further cited the strictly secret and centralized organizations of the past, Zunlia I Volia 13, and Narodnaya Volia 14. Around them, he said, were grouped a large number of people who did not belong to the organization but who helped it in one way or another and who were regarded as party members. This principle should be even more strictly observed in the Social Democratic organization. Here we come to one of the key points of the matter. Is this principle really a social democratic one, this principle which allows people who do not belong to any of the organizations of the party, but only help it in one way or another, to call themselves party members? And Plekhanov gave the only possible reply to this question when he said, Axelrod was wrong in citing the 70s. At that time there was a well-organized and splendidly disciplined center, around it there were the organizations of various categories, which it had created. And what remained outside these organizations was chaos, anarchy. The component elements of this chaos called themselves party members, but this harmed rather than benefited the cause. We should not imitate the anarchy of the 70s, but avoid it. Thus this principle, which Comrade Axelrod wanted to pass off as a social democratic one, is in reality an anarchistic principle. To refute this, one would have to show that control, direction, and discipline are possible outside an organization, and that conferring the title of party members on elements of chaos is necessary. The supporters of Comrade Martov's formulation did not show, and could not show, either of these things. Comrade Axelrod took as an example a professor who regards himself as a social democrat and declares himself such. To complete the thought contained in this example, Comrade Axelrod should have gone on to tell us whether the organized social democrats themselves regard this professor as a social democrat. By failing to raise this further question, Comrade Axelrod abandoned his argument halfway. After all, one thing or the other. Either the organized social democrats regard the professor in question as a social democrat, in which case why should they not enroll him in one of the social democratic organizations? For only if the professor is thus enrolled will his declaration answer to his actions, and not be empty talk, as professorial declarations all too frequently are. or the organized Social Democrats do not regard the professor as a Social Democrat, in which case it would be absurd, senseless and harmful to allow him the right to bear the honorable and responsible title of party member. The matter therefore reduces itself to the alternative, consistent application of the principle of organization, or the sanctification of disunity and anarchy. Are we to build the party on the basis of that already formed and welded core of Social Democrats which brought about the Party Congress, for instance, and which should enlarge and multiply party organizations of all kinds, or are we to content ourselves with the soothing phrase that all who help are party members? If we adopt Lenin's formula, Comrade Axelrod continued, we shall be throwing overboard a section of those who, even if they cannot be directly admitted to an organization, are nevertheless party members. The confusion of concepts of which Comrade Axelrod wanted to accuse me stands out here quite clearly in his own case. He already takes it for granted that all who help are party members, whereas that is what the whole argument is about, and our opponents have still to prove the necessity and value of such an interpretation. What is the meaning of the phrase throwing overboard, which at first glance seems so terrible? Even if only members of organizations recognized as party organizations are regarded as party members, people who cannot directly join any party organization can still work in an organization which does not belong to the party but is associated with it. Consequently, there can be no talk of throwing anyone overboard in the sense of preventing them from working, from taking part in the movement. On the contrary, the stronger our party organizations, consisting of real Social Democrats, the less wavering and instability there is within the party, the broader, more varied, richer, and more fruitful will be the party's influence on the elements of the working class masses surrounding it and guided by it. The party, as the vanguard of the working class, must not be confused, after all, with the entire class. And Comrade Axelrod is guilty of just this confusion, which is characteristic of our opportunistic communism in general, when he says, first and foremost we are, of course, creating an organization of the most active elements of the party, an organization of revolutionaries, but since we are the party of a class, we must take care not to leave outside the party ranks people who consciously, though perhaps not very actively, associate themselves with that party. Firstly, the active elements of the Social Democratic Working Class Party will include not only organizations of revolutionaries, but a whole number of workers' organizations recognized as party organizations. Secondly, how, by what logic, does the fact that we are the party of a class warrant the conclusion that it is unnecessary to make a distinction between those who belong to the party and those who associate themselves with it? Just the contrary, precisely because there are differences in degree of consciousness and degree of activity, a distinction must be made in degree of proximity to the party. We are the party of a class, and therefore almost the entire class, and in times of war, in a period of civil war, the entire class should act under the leadership of our party, should adhere to our party as closely as possible. But it would be Manilovism 15, and Taoism to think that the entire class, or almost the entire class, can ever rise, under capitalism, to the level of consciousness and activity of its vanguard, of its Social Democratic Party. No sensible Social Democrat has ever doubted that under capitalism even the trade union organizations, which are more primitive and more comprehensible to the undeveloped sections, are incapable of embracing the entire, or almost the entire, working class. To forget the distinction between the vanguard and the whole of the masses gravitating towards it, to forget the vanguard's constant duty of raising ever wider sections to its own advanced level, means simply to deceive oneself, to shut one's eyes to the immensity of our tasks, and to narrow down these tasks. And it is just such a shutting of one's eyes, it is just such forgetfulness, to obliterate the difference between those who associate themselves and those who belong, those who are conscious and active and those who only help. To argue that we are the party of a class in justification of organizational looseness, in justification of confusing organization with disorganization, is to repeat the mistake of Nadstin, who confused the philosophical and social historical question of the depth of the roots of the movement with the technical and organizational question, what is to be done? p. 91. 3. It is this confusion, wrought by the deft hand of Comrade Axelrod, that was then repeated dozens of times by the speakers who defended Comrade Martov's formulation. The more widespread the title of party member, the better, said Martov, without, however, explaining the benefit of the widespread title which did not correspond to fact. Can it be denied that control over party members who do not belong to a party organization is a mere fiction? A widespread fiction is not beneficial, but harmful. We could only rejoice if every striker, every demonstrator, answering for his actions, could proclaim himself a party member. p. 239. Is that so? Every striker should have the right to proclaim himself a party member? In this statement, Comrade Martov instantly carries his mistake to the point of absurdity, by lowering social democracy to the level of mere strike-making, thereby repeating the misadventures of the Akimovs. We could only rejoice if the Social Democrats succeeded in directing every strike, for it is their plain and unquestionable duty to direct every manifestation of the class struggle of the proletariat, and strikes are one of the most profound and most powerful manifestations of that struggle. But we should be tail-enders if we were to identify this primary form of struggle, which ipso facto is no more than a trade unionist form, with the all-round and conscious social democratic struggle. We should be opportunistically legitimizing a patent falsehood if we were to allow every striker the right to proclaim himself a party member, for in the majority of cases such a proclamation would be false. We should be indulging in complacent daydreaming if we tried to assure ourselves and others that every striker can be a social democrat and a member of the Social Democratic Party, in face of that infinite disunity, oppression, and stultification which under capitalism is bound to weigh down upon such very wide sections of the untrained, unskilled workers. This example of the striker brings out with particular clarity the difference between the revolutionary striving to direct every strike in a social democratic way and the opportunist phrase-mongering which proclaims every striker a party member. We are the party of a class inasmuch as we in fact direct almost the entire, or even the entire, proletarian class in a social democratic way, but only Akimovs can conclude from this that we must inward identify the party and the class. I am not afraid of a conspiratorial organization, said Comrade Martov in this same speech, but, he added, for me a conspiratorial organization has meaning only when it is enveloped by a broad social democratic working class party, p. 239. To be exact, he should have said, when it is enveloped by a broad social democratic working class movement. And in that form Comrade Martov's proposition would have been not only indisputable, but a plain truism. I dwell on this point only because subsequent speakers turned Comrade Martov's truism into the very prevalent and very vulgar argument that Lenin wants to confine the sum total of party members to the sum total of conspirators. This conclusion, which can only provoke a smile, was drawn both by Comrade Bozedovsky and by Comrade Popov, and when it was taken up by Martinov and Akimov, its true character of an opportunist phrase became altogether manifest. Today Comrade Axelrod is developing this same argument in the New Iskra by way of acquainting the reading public with the new editorial board's new views on organization. Already at the Congress, at the very first sitting where paragraph 1 was discussed, I noticed that our opponents wanted to avail themselves of this cheap weapon, and therefore warned in my speech, p. 240, it should not be imagined that party organizations must consist solely of professional revolutionaries. We need the most diverse organizations of all types, ranks, and shades, beginning with extremely limited and secret and ending with very broad, free, loose organization. This is such an obvious and self-evident truth that I did not think it necessary to dwell on it. But today, when we have been dragged back in so many respects, one has to repeat old lessons on this subject too. In order to do so, I shall quote certain passages from What is to be Done? And A Letter to a Comrade. A circle of leaders of the type of Alexeyev and Mishkin, of Kalchurin and Zelyabov, is capable of coping with political tasks in the genuine and most practical sense of the term, for the reason and to the extent that their impassioned propaganda meets with response among the spontaneously awakening masses, and their sparkling energy is answered and supported by the energy of the revolutionary class. For, in order to be a social democratic party, we must win the support precisely of the class. It is not that the party should envelop the conspiratorial organization, as Comrade Martov thought, but that the revolutionary class, the proletariat, should envelop the party, the latter to include both conspiratorial and non-conspiratorial organizations. The workers' organizations for the economic struggle should be trade union organizations. Every social democratic worker should as far as possible assist and actively work in these organizations. But It is certainly not in our interest to demand that only Social Democrats should be eligible for membership in the trade unions, since that would only narrow the scope of our influence upon the masses. Let every worker who understands the need to unite for the struggle against the employers and the government join the trade unions. The very aim of the trade unions would be impossible of achievement if they did not unite all who have attained at least this elementary degree of understanding, if they were not very broad organizations. The broader these organizations, the broader will be our influence over them, an influence due, not only to the spontaneous development of the economic struggle, but to the direct and conscious effort of the socialist trade union members to influence their comrades. p. 86. 5. Incidentally, the example of the trade unions is particularly significant for an assessment of the controversial question of paragraph 1. That these unions should work under the control and direction of the social democratic organizations, of that there can be no two opinions among social democrats. But on those grounds to confer on all members of trade unions the right to proclaim themselves members of the Social Democratic Party would be an obvious absurdity and would constitute a double danger, on the one hand, of narrowing the dimensions of the trade union movement and thus weakening the solidarity of the workers, and, on the other, of opening the door of the Social Democratic Party to vagueness and vacillation. The German Social Democrats had occasion to solve a similar problem in a practical instance, in the celebrated case of the Hamburg bricklayers working on piece rates. 16. The Social Democrats did not hesitate for a moment to proclaim strike-breaking dishonorable in Social Democratic eyes, that is, to acknowledge that to direct and support strikes was their own vital concern, but at the same time they just as resolutely rejected the demand for identifying the interests of the party with the interests of the trade unions, for making the party responsible for individual acts of individual trade unions. The party should and will strive to imbue the trade unions with its spirit and bring them under its influence, but precisely in order to do so it must distinguish the fully social democratic elements in these unions, the elements belonging to the Social Democratic Party, from those which are not fully class-conscious and politically active, and not confuse the two, as Comrade Axelrod would have us do. Centralization of the most secret functions in an organization of revolutionaries will not diminish, but rather increase the extent and enhance the quality of the activity of a large number of other organizations that are intended for a broad public and are therefore as loose and as non-secret as possible, such as workers' trade unions, workers' self-education circles and circles for reading illegal literature, and socialist, as well as democratic, circles among all other sections of the population, etc. etc. We must have such circles, trade unions, and organizations everywhere in as large a number as possible and with the widest variety of functions, but it would be absurd and harmful to confound them with the organization of revolutionaries, to efface the border line between them. p. 96. 6. This quotation shows how out of place it was for Comrade Martov to remind me that the organization of revolutionaries should be enveloped by broad organizations of workers. I had already pointed this out in What Is to Be Done ? And in a letter to a comrade I developed this idea more concretely. Factory circles, I wrote there, are particularly important to us. The main strength of the movement lies in the organization of the workers at the large factories, for the large factories and mills contain not only the predominant part of the working class, as regards numbers, but even more as regards influence, development, and fighting capacity. Every factory must be our fortress. The factory subcommittee should endeavor to embrace the whole factory, the largest possible number of the workers, with a network of all kinds of circles, or agents, all groups, circles, subcommittees, etc., should enjoy the status of committee institutions or branches of a committee. Some of them will openly declare their wish to join the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and, if endorsed by the committee, will join the party, and will assume definite functions, on the instructions of, or in agreement with, the committee, will undertake to obey the orders of the party organs, receive the same rights as all party members, and be regarded as immediate candidates for membership of the committee, etc. Others will not join the RSDLP, and will have the status of circles formed by party members, or associated with one party group or another, etc. Pages 17 to 18. 7. The words I have underlined make it particularly clear that the idea of my formulation of paragraph 1 was already fully expressed in a letter to a comrade. The conditions for joining the party are directly indicated there, namely, 1. A certain degree of organization, and 2. Endorsement by a party committee. A page later I roughly indicate also what groups and organizations should, or should not, be admitted to the party, and for what reasons. The distributing groups should belong to the RSDLP and know a certain number of its members and functionaries. The groups for studying labor conditions and drawing up trade union demands need not necessarily belong to the RSDLP. Groups of students, officers, or office employees engaged in self-education in conjunction with one or two party members should in some cases not even be aware that these belong to the party, etc. Pages 18 to 19. 8. There you have additional material on the subject of the open visor. Whereas the formula of Comrade Martoff's draft does not even touch on relations between the party and the organizations, I pointed out nearly a year before the Congress that some organizations should belong to the party, and others not. In a letter to a comrade, the idea I advocated at the Congress was already clearly outlined. The matter might be put graphically in the following way. Depending on degree of organization in general and of secrecy of organization in particular, roughly the following categories may be distinguished: 1. Organizations of revolutionaries. 2. Organizations of workers. As broad and as varied as possible. I confine myself to the working class, taking it as self-evident that, under certain conditions, certain elements of other classes will also be included here. These two categories constitute the party. Further, 3. Workers' organizations associated with the party. 4. Workers' organizations not associated with the party but actually under its control and direction. 5. Unorganized elements of the working class, who in part also come under the direction of the Social Democratic Party, at any rate during big manifestations of the class struggle. That, approximately, is how the matter presents itself to me. As Comrade Martoff sees it, on the contrary, the borderline of the party remains absolutely vague, for every striker can proclaim himself a party member. What benefit is there in this looseness? A widespread title. Its harm is that it introduces a disorganizing idea, the confusing of class and party. In illustration of the general propositions we have adduced, let us take a cursory glance at the further discussion of paragraph 1 at the Congress. Comrade Bruguiere, to the great glee of Comrade Martoff, pronounced in favor of my formulation, but his alliance with me, unlike Comrade Akimoff's with Martoff, turned out to be based on a misunderstanding. Comrade Bruguiere did not agree with the rules as a whole, with their entire spirit, p. 239, and defended my formulation as the basis of the democracy which the supporters of Rabotchi ideology desired. Comrade Bruguiere had not yet risen to the view that in a political struggle it is sometimes necessary to choose the lesser evil. Comrade Bruguiere did not realize that it was useless to advocate democracy at a Congress like ours. Comrade Akimoff was more perspicacious. He put the question quite rightly when he stated that Comrades Martoff and Lenin are arguing as to which formulation will best achieve their common aim. p. 252, Bruguiere and I, he continued, want to choose the one which will least achieve that aim. From this angle I choose Martoff's formulation. And Comrade Akimoff frankly explained that he considered their very aim, that is, the aim of Plekhanov, Martoff, and myself, the creation of a directing organization of revolutionaries, to be impracticable and harmful. Like Comrade Martinoff. 9. Comrade Martinoff, it is true, wanted to be different from Comrade Akimoff. He wanted to show that conspiratorial did not mean secret, that behind the two different words were two different concepts. What the difference is, neither Comrade Martinoff nor Comrade Axelrod, who is now following in his footsteps, ever did explain. Comrade Martinoff acted as if I had not, for example in What is to be Done? As well as in the tasks, see present edition, Volume 2, pages 323 to 51. Ed. Resolutely opposed confining the political struggle to conspiracy. Comrade Martinoff was anxious to have his hearers forget that the people I had been fighting had not seen any necessity for an organization of revolutionaries, just as Comrade Akimoff did not see it now. Lenin, he advocated the economist idea that an organization of revolutionaries was unnecessary. He was confident that in the end the realities of life will force their way into our party organization, whether you bar their path with Martoff's formulation or with Lenin's. It would not be worthwhile dwelling on this tale-ist conception of the realities of life if we did not encounter it in the case of Comrade Martoff too. In general, Comrade Martoff's second speech, p. 245, is so interesting that it deserves to be examined in detail. Comrade Martov's first argument, control by the party organizations over party members not belonging to them is practicable, inasmuch as, having assigned a function to someone, the committee will be able to watch over it. p. 245. This thesis is remarkably characteristic, for it betrays, if one may so put it, who needs Martov's formulation and whom it will serve in actual fact, freelance intellectuals or workers' groups and the worker masses. The fact is that there are two possible interpretations of Martov's formulation. 1. That anyone who renders the party regular personal assistance under the direction of one of its organizations is entitled to proclaim himself, Comrade Martov's own words, a party member. 2. That a party organization is entitled to regard as a party member anyone who renders it regular personal assistance under its direction. It is only the first interpretation that really gives every striker the opportunity to call himself a party member, and accordingly it alone immediately won the hearts of the Liebers, Akimovs, and Martinovs. But this interpretation is manifestly no more than a phrase, because it would apply to the entire working class, and the distinction between party and class would be obliterated. Control over and direction of every striker can only be spoken of symbolically. That is why, in his second speech, Comrade Martov at once slipped into the second interpretation, even though, be it said in parenthesis, it was directly rejected by the Congress when it turned down Kostich's resolution, p. 255, namely, that a committee would assign functions and watch over their fulfillment. Such special assignments will never, of course, be made to the mass of the workers, to the thousands of proletarians, of whom Comrade Axelrod and Comrade Martinov spoke. They will frequently be given precisely to those professors whom Comrade Axelrod mentioned, to those high school students for whom Comrade Lieber and Comrade Popov were so concerned, p. 241, and to the revolutionary youth to whom Comrade Axelrod referred in his second speech, p. 242. In a word, Comrade Martov's formula will either remain a dead letter, an empty phrase, or it will be of benefit mainly and almost exclusively to intellectuals who are thoroughly imbued with bourgeois individualism and do not wish to join an organization. In words, Martov's formulation defends the interests of the broad strata of the proletariat, but in fact it serves the interests of the bourgeois intellectuals, who fight shy of proletarian discipline and organization. No one will venture to deny that the intelligentsia, as a special stratum of modern capitalist society, is characterized, by and large, precisely by individualism and incapacity for discipline and organization. Cf., for example, Kautsky's well-known articles on the intelligentsia. This, incidentally, is a feature which unfavorably distinguishes this social stratum from the proletariat. It is one of the reasons for the flabbiness and instability of the intellectual, which the proletariat so often feels, and this trait of the intelligentsia is intimately bound up with its customary mode of life, its mode of earning a livelihood, which in a great many respects approximates to the petty bourgeois mode of existence, working in isolation or in very small groups, etc. Nor is it fortuitous, lastly, that the defenders of Comrade Martov's formulation were the ones who had to cite the example of professors and high school students. It was not champions of a broad proletarian struggle who, in the controversy over paragraph 1, took the field against champions of a radically conspiratorial organization, as Comrades Martinov and Axelrod thought, but the supporters of bourgeois intellectual individualism who clashed with the supporters of proletarian organization and discipline. Comrade Popov said, everywhere, in St. Petersburg as in Nikolaev or Odessa, as the representatives from these towns testify, there are dozens of workers who are distributing literature and carrying on word-of-mouth agitation but who cannot be members of an organization. They can be attached to an organization, but not regarded as members. p. 241. Why they cannot be members of an organization remained Comrade Popov's secret. I have already quoted the passage from a letter to a comrade showing that the admission of all such workers, by the hundred, not the dozen, to an organization is both possible and necessary, and, moreover, that a great many of these organizations can and should belong to the party. Comrade Martov's second argument, in Lenin's opinion there should be no organizations in the party other than party organizations. Quite true. In my opinion, on the contrary, such organizations should exist. Life creates and breeds organizations faster than we can include them in the hierarchy of our militant organization of professional revolutionaries. That is untrue in two respects. 1. The number of effective organizations of revolutionaries that life breeds is far less than we need, than the working class movement requires. 2. Our party should be a hierarchy not only of organizations of revolutionaries, but of a mass of workers' organizations as well. Lenin thinks that the Central Committee will confer the title of party organizations only on such as are fully reliable in the matter of principles. But Comrade Bruckner understands very well that life, will assert itself and that the Central Committee, in order not to leave a multitude of organizations outside the party, will have to legitimize them despite their not quite reliable character. That is why Comrade Bruckner associates himself with Lenin. What a truly Taoist conception of life. Of course, if the Central Committee had necessarily to consist of people who were not guided by their own opinions, but by what others might say, vide the organizing committee incident, then life would assert itself in the sense that the most backward elements in the party would gain the upper hand, as has in fact happened now when the backward elements have taken shape as the party minority. But no intelligent reason can be given which would induce a sensible Central Committee to admit unreliable elements to the party. By this reference to life, which breeds unreliable elements, Comrade Martov patently revealed the opportunist character of his plan of organization. I for my part think, he continued, that if such an organization, one that is not quite reliable, is prepared to accept the party program and party control, we may admit it to the party, without thereby making it a party organization. I would consider it a great triumph for our party if, for example, some Union of Independents were to declare that they accepted the views of social democracy and its program and were joining the party, which does not, however, mean that we would include the Union in the party organization. Such as the muddle Martov's formulation leads to, non-party organizations belonging to the party. Just imagine his scheme: the party equals 1. Organizations of revolutionaries, plus 2. Workers' organizations recognized as party organizations, plus 3. Workers' organizations not recognized as party organizations, consisting principally of independents, plus 4. Individuals performing various functions, professors, high school students, etc., plus 5. Every striker. Alongside of this remarkable plan one can only put the words of Comrade Lieber: our task is not only to organize an organization. We can and should organize a party, p. 241. Yes, of course, we can and should do that, but what it requires is not meaningless words about organizing organizations, but the unequivocal demand that party members should work to create an organization. In fact, me who talks about organizing a party and yet defends using the word party to cover disorganization and disunity of every kind is just indulging in empty words. Our formulation, Comrade Martov said, expresses the desire to have a series of organizations between the organization of revolutionaries and the masses. It does not. This truly essential desire is just what Martov's formulation does not express, for it does not offer an incentive to organize, does not contain a demand for organization, does not separate organized from unorganized. All it offers is a title. 10. At the League Congress, Comrade Martov adduced one more argument in support of his formulation, an argument that deserves to be laughed at. We might point out, he said, that, taken literally, Lenin's formulation excludes the agents of the Central Committee from the party, for they do not constitute an organization, p. 59. Even at the League Congress this argument was greeted with laughter, as the minutes record. Comrade Martov supposes that the difficulty he mentions can only be solved by including the Central Committee agents in the organization of the Central Committee. But that is not the point. The point is, that Comrade Martov's example saliently demonstrates that he completely fails to understand the idea of paragraph 1. It was a sheer specimen of pedantic criticism that did indeed deserve to be laughed at. Formally speaking, all that would be required would be to form an organization of Central Committee agents, pass a resolution to include it in the party, and the difficulty which caused Comrade Martov so much brain-racking would immediately vanish. The idea of paragraph 1 as formulated by me consists in the incentive to organize, it consists in guaranteeing actual control and direction. Essentially, the very question whether the Central Committee agents will belong to the party is ridiculous, for actual control over them is fully and absolutely guaranteed by the very fact that they have been appointed agents and that they are kept on as agents. Consequently, here there can be no question of any confusion of organized and unorganized, which is the root mistake in Comrade Martov's formulation. Why Comrade Martov's formulation is no good is that it allows anyone, any opportunist, any windbag, any professor, and any high school student to proclaim himself a party member. It is in vain for Comrade Martov to try to talk away this Achilles heel of his formulation by examples in which there can be no question of people arbitrarily styling or proclaiming themselves members. Lenin, and in this connection we cannot but recall Comrade Axelrod's words, "No decree can forbid them, circles of revolutionary youth and the like, or individuals to call themselves social democrats, true enough, and even to regard themselves as part of the party now that is not true at all. It is impossible and pointless to forbid anyone to call himself a social democrat, for in its direct sense this word only signifies a system of convictions, and not definite organizational relations. But as to forbidding various circles and persons to regard themselves as part of the party, that can and should be done if these circles and persons injure the party, corrupt or disorganize it. It would be absurd to speak of the party as of a whole, as of a political entity, if it could not by decree forbid a circle to regard itself as part of the whole. What in that case would be the point of defining the procedure and conditions of expulsion from the party? Comrade Axelrod reduced Comrade Martov's fundamental mistake to an obvious absurdity. He even elevated this mistake to an opportunist theory when he added, as formulated by Lenin, paragraph 1 directly conflicts in principle with the very nature, and aims of the Social Democratic Party of the Proletariat, p. 243. This means nothing less than that making higher demands of the party than of the class conflicts in principle with the very nature of the aims of the proletariat. It is not surprising that Eklimov was heart and soul in favor of such a theory. It should be said in fairness that Comrade Axelrod, who now wants to convert this mistaken formulation, one obviously tending towards opportunism, into the germ of new views, at the Congress, on the contrary, expressed a readiness to bargain, saying, "But I observe that I am knocking at an open door. I observe this in the new Iskra too, because Comrade Lenin, with his peripheral circles which are to be regarded as part of the party organization, goes out to meet my demand. And not only with the peripheral circles, but with every kind of workers' union, cf. p. 242 of the minutes, the speech of Comrade Strakhoff, and the passages from What is to be Done? And a letter to a comrade quoted above. There still remain the individuals, but here, too, we could bargain." I replied to Comrade Axelrod that, generally speaking, I was not averse to bargaining, and I must now explain in what sense this was meant. As regards the individuals, all those professors, high school students, etc. I would least of all have agreed to make concessions, but if doubts had been aroused as to the workers' organizations, I would have agreed, despite the utter groundlessness of such doubts, as I have proved above, to add to my paragraph 1 a note to the following effect: workers' organizations which accept the program and rules of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party should be included in the largest possible numbers among the party organizations. Strictly speaking, of course, the place for such a recommendation is not in the rules, which should be confined to statutory definitions, but in explanatory commentaries and pamphlets, and I have already pointed out that I gave such explanations in my pamphlets long before the rules were drawn up, but at least such a note would not contain even a shadow of wrong ideas capable of leading to disorganization, not a shadow of the opportunist arguments 11. To this category of arguments, which inevitably crop up when attempts are made to justify Martov's formulation belongs, in particular, Comrade Trotsky's statement, pages 248 and 346, that opportunism is produced by more complex, or, is determined by deeper, causes than one or another clause in the rules. It is brought about by the relative level of development of bourgeois democracy and the proletariat. The point is not that clauses in the rules may produce opportunism, but that with their help a more or a less trenchant weapon against opportunism can be forged. The deeper its causes, the more trenchant should this weapon be. Therefore, to justify a formulation which opens the door to opportunism on the grounds that opportunism has deep causes is Taoism of the first water. When Comrade Trotsky was opposed to Comrade Lieber, he understood that the rules constitute the organized distrust of the whole towards the part, of the vanguard towards the backward contingent, but when Comrade Trotsky came to be on Comrade Lieber's side, he forgot this and even began to justify the weakness and instability of our organization of this distrust. distrust of opportunism, by talking about complex causes, the level of development of the proletariat, etc. Here is another of Comrade Trotsky's arguments. It is much easier for the intellectual youth, organized in one way or another, to enter themselves, my italics, on the rolls of the party. Just so. That is why it is the formulation by which even unorganized elements may proclaim themselves party members that suffers from intellectualist vagueness, and not my formulation, which obviates the right to enter oneself on the rolls. Comrade Trotsky said that if the Central Committee refused to recognize an organization of opportunists, it would only be because of the character of certain individuals, and that since these individuals would be known as political personalities, they would not be dangerous and could be removed by a general party boycott. This is only true of cases when people have to be removed from the party, and only half true at that, because an organized party removes members by a vote and not by a boycott. It is absolutely untrue of the far more frequent cases when removal would be absurd, and when all that is required is control. For purposes of control, the Central Committee might, on certain conditions, deliberately admit to the party an organization which was not quite reliable but which was capable of working. It might do so with the object of testing it, of trying to direct it onto the right path, of correcting its partial aberrations by guidance etc. This would not be dangerous if in general self-entering on the party rolls were not allowed. It would often be useful for an open and responsible, controlled expression, and discussion, of mistaken views and mistaken tactics. But if statutory definitions are to correspond to actual relations, Comrade Lenin's formulation must be rejected, said Comrade Trotsky, and again he spoke like an opportunist. Actual relations are not a dead thing. They live and develop. Statutory definitions may correspond to the progressive development of those relations, but they may also, if the definitions are bad ones, correspond to retrogression or stagnation. The latter case is the case of Comrade Martov. Lenin and anarchistic conceptions that are undoubtedly inherent in Comrade Martov's formulation. This last expression, given by me in quotation marks, is that of Comrade Pavlovich, who quite justly characterized as anarchism the recognition of irresponsible and self-enrolled party members. Translated into simple terms, said Comrade Pavlovich, explaining my formulation to Comrade Lieber, it means, if you want to be a party member, your acceptance of organizational relations too must be not merely platonic. Simple as this translation was, it seems it was not superfluous, as events since the Congress have shown, not only for various dubious professors and high school students, but for honest-to-goodness party members, for people at the top. With no less justice, Comrade Pavlovich pointed to the contradiction between Comrade Martov's formulation and the indisputable precept of scientific socialism which Comrade Martov quoted so unhappily, our party is the conscious spokesman of an unconscious process. Exactly. And for that very reason it is wrong to want every striker to have the right to call himself a party member, for if every strike were not only a spontaneous expression of the powerful class instinct and of the class struggle which is leading inevitably to the social revolution, but a conscious expression of that process, then the general strike would not be an anarchist phrase, then our party would forthwith and at once embrace the whole working class, and, consequently, would at once put an end to bourgeois society as a whole. If it is to be a conscious spokesman in fact, the party must be able to work out organizational relations that will ensure a definite level of consciousness and systematically raise this level. If we are to go the way of Martov, Comrade Pavlovich said, we should first of all delete the clause on accepting the program, for before a program can be accepted it must be mastered and understood. Acceptance of the program presupposes a fairly high level of political consciousness. We shall never allow support of social democracy, participation in the struggle it directs, to be artificially restricted by any requirements, mastery, understanding, etc., for this participation itself, the very fact of it, promotes both consciousness and the instinct for organization. But since we have joined together in a party to carry on systematic work, we must see to it that it is systematic. That Comrade Pavlovich's warning regarding the program was not superfluous became apparent at once, during that very same sitting. Comrades Zakimov and Lieber, who secured the adoption of Comrade Martov's formulation, 12-12, the vote was 28 for and 22 against. Of the 8 anti-Escroists, 7 were for Martov and 1 for me. Without the aid of the opportunists, Comrade Martov would not have secured adoption of his opportunist formulation. At the League Congress, Comrade Martov tried very unsuccessfully to refute this undoubted fact, for some reason mentioning only the votes of the Bundists and forgetting about Comrade Akimov and his friends, or rather remembering them only when it could serve against me, Comrade Brookier's agreement with me. Lenin at once betrayed their true nature by demanding, pages 254-55, that in the case of the program to only Platonic acceptance only of its basic principles, should be required for membership in the party. Comrade Akimov's proposal is quite logical from Comrade Martov's standpoint, Comrade Pavlovich remarked. Unfortunately, we cannot see from the minutes how many votes this proposal of Akimov's secured. In all probability, not less than 5 Bundists, Akimov, and Brukier. And it was the withdrawal of 7 delegates from the Congress that converted the compact majority, anti-Escroists, Center, and Martovites, which began to form over paragraph 1 of the rules into a compact minority. It was the withdrawal of 7 delegates that resulted in the defeat of the motion to endorse the old editorial board, that supposed howling violation of continuity in the Iskra editorship. A curious 7 it was that constituted the sole salvation and guarantee of Iskra continuity, the Bundists, Akimov, and Brukier. That is, the very delegates who voted against the motives for adopting Iskra as the central organ, the very delegates whose opportunism was acknowledged dozens of times by the Congress, and acknowledged in particular by Martov and Plekhanov in the matter of toning down paragraph 1 in reference to the program. The continuity of Iskra guarded by the anti-Iskroists! This brings us to the starting point of the post-Congress tragicomedy. The grouping of votes over paragraph 1 of the rules revealed a phenomenon of exactly the same type as the equality of languages incident. The falling away of 1/4, approximately, of the Iskra majority made possible the victory of the anti-Iskroists, who were backed by the center. Of course, here too there were individual votes which disturbed the full symmetry of the picture. In so large an assembly as our Congress there are bound to be some strays who shift quite fortuitously from one side to the other, especially on a question like paragraph 1, where the true character of the divergence was only beginning to emerge and many delegates had simply not yet found their bearings, considering that the question had not been discussed beforehand in the press. 5 votes fell away from the majority Iskroists, Rusov and Karski with 2 votes each, and Lenski with 1. On the other hand, they were joined by 1 anti-Iskroist, Brukier, and by 3 from the center, Medvedev, Igorov and Zuriev. The result was a total of 23 votes, 24-5 plus 4, 1 vote less than in the final grouping in the elections. It was the anti-Iskroists who gave Martov his majority, 7 of them voting for him and 1 for me. Of the center 7 voted for Martov, and 3 for me. That coalition of the minority Iskroists with the anti-Iskroists and the center which formed a compact minority at the end of the Congress and after the Congress was beginning to take shape. The political error of Martov and Axelrod, who undoubtedly took a step towards opportunism and anarchistic individualism in their formulation of paragraph 1, and especially in their defense of that formulation, was revealed at once and very clearly thanks to the free and open arena offered by the Congress. It was revealed in the fact that the least stable elements, the least steadfast in principle, at once employed all their forces to widen the fissure, the breach, that appeared in the views of the revolutionary Social Democrats. Working together at the Congress were people who in matters of organization frankly pursued different aims. See Akimov's speech, a circumstance which at once induced those who were in principle opposed to our organizational plan and our rules to support the error of comrades Martov and Axelrod. The Iskroists who on this question too remained faithful to the views of revolutionary social democracy found themselves in the minority. This is a point of the utmost importance, for unless it is grasped it is absolutely impossible to understand either the struggle over the details of the rules or the struggle over the personal composition of the central organ and the central committee.